other things. One of the primary roles is planning the evolution of the grid, and the subject of today's deep dialogue is their economic study process, and in particular, the current 2024 study, which runs through the end of this year. This is a 2-year study that models a possible resource mix that meets state policy goals regarding CO2 emissions through the year 2050, so 25 years into the future, while demand for reliable, affordable electricity roughly doubles. We'll be hearing from 3 ISO New England people. The first, Carrie Schlichting, Supervisor of State Policy, External Affairs. She's responsible for liaising with government officials in Connecticut and Rhode Island and supporting regional collaboration with all the New England states related to the clean energy transition and regional issues. Her work includes analyzing energy legislation and administrative activity at the state public utility commissions and energy offices, as well as managing ISO New England's outreach to government officials during power system events and emergencies. And I just checked the ISO To Go app on my phone. Maybe others of you have. It looks like the demand is closely tracking the forecast. System status is normal. So thank you for that. And Carrie, I think hopefully you wanted to be caught up in any emergencies today. Richard Kornitsky is an engineer at ISO New England with expertise in economic modeling for power systems and clean energy integration. He's led multiple key studies, including the 2022 Economic Planning for Clean Energy Transition, also known as EPSET, and the 2024 Economic Study, which is the subject of today's talk. He uses advanced tools like Plexos to evaluate reliability, costs, and emission impact. He's dedicated to advancing sustainable energy solutions and supporting long-term transmission planning through innovative analysis. Ellie Ross is an assistant engineer at ISO New England, specializing in system planning through economic analysis. She served as a lead modeler for the 2024 economic study, which explores economic and environmental trade-offs of various regional decarbonization pathways. She's committed to applying data-driven methods to support a more resilient and sustainable system. So thank you all for presenting today. We'll break for questions twice during the presentation and again at the end. Please put your questions in the chat window and I'll read them when we pause for the questions. We often get questions about availability of slides and the recording. Both will be available after this, so you can save yourself a question. So if you could all please mute your audio to make things go more smoothly. I'll turn it over now to Carrie Schlichting of ISO New England. Carrie?
Hi, thank you, Roy, and thank you everyone for being here today. My role is to give a brief update on some of about the ISO and a brief update that gives the background of why we're doing these studies that Richard and Ellie are going to talk more about. So, Richard, are you ready for us to get started with the slides?
Yeah, I don't know if you can get those slides in the presentation mode.
Hold on a moment. Thought I was sharing my screen, and can you see my screen now?
Mm-hmm. Yes, yeah. But it's
right.
not full screen for the presentation. If
oh, is it not? Okay, let me try one more thing.
Mm-hmm.
Apologies.
You had it before during the dry run, so.
Of course I did.
It's the demo effect, right?
Yes. All right, is this better?
There you go.
Yes, that's perfect, yeah. Thank you.
All right.
All right, so next slide. We can skip right into this. As I said, that my role is here to give you a little bit of the understanding of what ISO is and then briefly what ISO is not. So we go to slide 4. The ISO has 3 critical roles that we must follow to ensure reliable electricity at competitive prices. So we are regulated by the FERC in Washington, D.C., and they oversee our 3 roles, which are grid operation. So that's the 24 hours a day balancing of supply and demand. market administration, where the ISO designs and runs and oversees the markets where the commodity of wholesale electricity is bought and sold. You can think of that as the stock exchange in New York City. We are the exchanging platform for those who are selling energy and those who want to buy energy. The ISO itself does not own any type of generation, and we do not make any money off these transactions. We facilitate the exchange to meet demand. And then we do power system planning. So that's where we will have our presentation about the economic studies from Richard and Ellie. And this involves a lot of different activities that are looking ahead for the New England region to see what will electricity demand be in the future, and what are some ways we can think about meeting that demand. Next slide. So some things that we don't do. We at the ISO have no responsibility or authority over retail electricity. So that is the bill you get in the mail and the wires that are bringing power to your house. Those are retail electric distribution, and those are overseen by the Public Utilities Commission, or in Massachusetts DPU, in Connecticut, PURA. We don't own any power grid infrastructure. As I said, the only physical things that ISO owns is our control centers in Western Massachusetts and Connecticut. We don't have any stakes in companies that own grid infrastructure. We are independent of any entities that are participating in the ISO marketplace. And we have no jurisdiction over fuel infrastructure. So be that, if we're thinking about fossil fuels, either pipelines or LNG storage tanks, or if we're thinking about other types of fuel that are coming into the system, we have no jurisdiction over those. We have no control over siting decisions. So the ISO cannot tell any state that a certain type of resource must be built or that it should be built in one place. Siting decisions fall under the authority of each individual state, and each individual state has different rules and procedures for approval of siting of energy facilities. And finally, we do not plan the resource mix. At ISO New England, we are technology neutral. The markets are designed to bring in resources that are dispatched at least cost. So the markets we are running them for an economic dispatch, not for a specific type of resource. So those are things we don't do. Next slide, please. This is at a very high level, the bulk power system, and to give you some concept of the numbers we're talking about, there are 9,000 miles of high voltage transmission lines. Again, these are 345 kV and 115 kV. These are not the retail lines that are on our streets in our communities. These are the large, big interstate transmission lines. We have nearly 3,000 megawatts of generating capacity in New England. We have 13 transmission interconnections to power systems in Eastern Canada and in New York. And last year, we imported about 9% of the region's overall energy needs. We have, as an entity in the 6 New England states, through ISO, invested significantly to strengthen the transmission system for reliability in the last 20 years. And there is additional work planned for reliability. And in New England, most of the New England states have set deep decarbonization goals to roughly 80% below 1990 levels by 2050. On the next slide, we can see that while we have so much installed capacity today, and that we know the states have policies for decarbonization looking into the future, at this point in time, we are at an inflection point. Since 1995, we have tracked annual net energy use in the region. And from 1995 to 2005, we saw significant growth each year. And then in 2005, we saw the beginnings of behind the meter solar PV installations beginning in the New England area, and the adoption of energy efficiency. Those two different resources, so behind the meter PV and energy efficiency, dramatically reduced the overall net energy use in the region over 20 years we saw a low just a couple years ago. As we look ahead in part of our system planning and functions at the ISO, we have a forecast for the next 10 years that we put out every spring in May that looks at all sorts of economic drivers to see what will power system demand be like potentially as a forecast over the next 10 years. And we have seen that in the state's pursuit of their greenhouse gas emissions goals and their zero carbon emission goals, there are strong incentives for conversion of vehicles to electric vehicles and conversion of building heating systems from fossil fueled to the electric system. So the electrification of the heating system and the of vehicle fleets is leading to an increase in net energy use due to electrification. So this is where we're at now. And as we look ahead in the regions, the work that Richard and Ellie are going to talk about is one of the ways that we are looking at potential scenarios that the region will be able to meet the estimated growth in demand. Roy, you had suggested we stop here for questions?
Yes, I'm not seeing any questions in the chat. I guess we can see if anyone has a question outside the chat. If so, unmute and raise your hand. Arnie, go ahead.
Yeah, I certainly understand the reduction in overall demand from energy efficiency. Could you explain what the role of behind the meter solar PV is in reducing the ISO New England measured demand?
Sure, it's a great question. So behind the meter solar PV is connected to the retail distribution system. ISO New England only has visibility into the bulk power system. So the the local distribution companies manage the retail system. So because we can't see what's happening on that side of the system, but we know where solar is being installed, and it is basically reducing demand behind the meter. So it is offsetting demand. That demand is still there, it's still being used, but these behind the meter solar projects are feeding into the grid, and we can see it as a net reduction in overall demand. It's the best way that we can estimate what those projects are doing.
And those of you who have the ISO2Go app on your phone can see that the first tab is the current supply and demand forecast with and without the behind the meter solar, so you can see the effect of that. Let's see, Ed.
Roy, I see there's a variety of questions in the chat. Is it okay if I sort of address them as a group?
Yes. Let's, I don't know if Ed came first, so let me see if Ed can ask his. It's not in the chat, it's just he's raised his hand. Ed Wool?
Thank you. No need to put me in priority. There are good questions in the chat. My question is, to what extent does this behind the meter solar PV and energy efficiency effects actually affect the peak demand so that you mitigate the need for more robust electricity transmission systems or transmission lines?
It's a good question. So those types of installations, energy efficiency and behind the meter solar PV, can reduce peak demand. But when we think about that type of targeted energy use reduction, that's more of a demand response type of program. So that's something that would be targeted at certain hours, and that uses things like smart devices. So a smart thermostat that can shut off today would be an example, would be like from 4 to 7 for our peak hour. that would have cooled earlier in the day and will come back on afterwards, or smart vehicle charging that wouldn't be charging at peak hours on the system, that would then displace that charging to other times in the region, other times in the day where the consumption of energy is lower. So those aren't energy efficiency specifically, but they're just a different type of energy resource. And we do have demand response that participate in the wholesale market, both actively and passively. So active demand response are resources that can be turned to, they can be dispatched to turn down their energy use. But the majority of those programs happen at the retail level. So those are state-run programs that would be calling for conservation on a day like today or tomorrow.
Thank you.
So
Carrie, why don't you take the first question?
Yeah, when we think about demand coming, does this forecast look at Bitcoin manufacturing and data centers? We know that AI is a really big driver of load growth in other places in the country. So far in New England, we have not seen that load growth coming, but we have a process, it would be known as a step load increase. So it would be a large new load interconnecting to the power system. Yes, if those types of projects are built in New England, they will increase demand, and we will start factoring them into our forecast. But as of yet, we've only had 1 or 2 of those types of projects, and they've been very small scale. So while we don't have a specific data center or AI line input in our forecast, it's something that our forecasters are watching really closely.
Okay.
And energy efficiency is an incredibly valuable resource in New England. It participates in the wholesale market. It has really reduced demand overall. And for the question about, are there further efficiency gains? A lot of what we think about as energy efficiency in New England right now is building stock. It's how we insulate our homes and buildings to most efficiently heat and cool them. So while a lot of things like light bulbs and refrigerators, those were the low-hanging fruit of energy efficiency projects, what the states that are looking at right now are how we improve window seals, doors, insulation in our homes to maximize the efficiency of heating and cooling buildings. And that's a challenge in New England because of the age of the buildings.
Let's see, did you see the one on at the bottom there from Karen Kraut on does energy use in the chart encompass the decrease in gas use? And I assume that's...
I think that
yes.
would probably mean natural gas for home heating.
Yes.
Is my best guess. And yes, there is a specific, we have a electrification forecast that is part of this overall forecast that looks at the replacement of natural gas boilers to electric heating resources. So yes, that is included in this chart.
Right. Okay, I think that's all except for Michael's, and he says to answer that after the presentation. So we'll come back to that one. I've made a note of that. So let's start again at slide 8 or 9.
Yeah, and I can take over from here. So I'll cover the first part, kind of going over what the economic studies are as a whole, and then I'm going to pass it over to Ellie to go over some of the specific results about the economic studies. So the economic study process is an informational process for the most part. It provides information to stakeholders to help facilitate the evaluation of what the economic and environmental impacts of the New England region is based on what our policies are, federal policies, states, various technology resources and goals to meet the future demands of the system. This can include a lot of different things. It's, changing resource mix, as Carrie showed earlier. It's also a changing load that we're facing, a lot of different characteristics. And one of the key parts of the economic studies is it also identifies potential system efficiency issues on the New England transmission system. And this is the one with kind of the dollar signs behind it. And I'll go over what the particular scenarios we study in the next slide. But this is the one where we could actually build transmission off of the system efficiency need scenario. And if we find that in a 10-year horizon that we meet a certain threshold, there's so much inefficiencies of congestion, we call it, And you can think of congestion as, we have a transmission line going from A to B, and then, that's been used at its largest capacity. Let's say it's a 500 megawatt line, or sorry, let's say it's a 100 megawatt line, and all 100 megawatts are being used, and there still needs to be electricity going from A to B. Well, that electricity is going to have to go through a different route, and that might be a little bit more expensive. So when I talk about congestion, that's kind of where that value is coming from. And so once it reaches a certain threshold, it might be economic to actually go out and build more transmission. And that's what that process does. The economic study process itself, this year's study started in 2024 in January, and it's expected to conclude in December. And then a little bit about the system efficiency need scenario. All right, so what are we actually studying here? The economic studies is based off these 4 framework scenarios. So we have this model, and I'll go over a little bit more in detail. It's called Plexos, and it's able to essentially model the grid in very good detail. We model not only the physical aspects of the grid, but we also model the economic aspects, so we can understand how our markets are performing with these new technologies. We can understand how resources are handling these new demands on them from a physical perspective as well. So there's various levels of details that we can put into these models, but to tune these, we have the benchmark scenario. So we take historical data. So for the 24 economic study, we looked at 2023, and we essentially tried to recreate the 2023 New England system, all 8760 hours. So every hour of the year, we were able to model a fully detailed New England system and get our models as tuned as possible. So if we see that maybe our prices are not looking great, or our loads aren't looking like it was happening in the past, an individual generator might be operating more or less. That helps us tune our models to kind of really get it nice and clean before we go to these future looking scenarios. I mentioned earlier the system efficiency need scenario. So again, we're looking 10 years out here. So for the 24 economic studies, we're going to be looking at 2034. And we're going to say, is there economic inefficiencies on the system? Is there a need to build transmission? And what we can do is, if we do find that there's a certain need, it meets a certain threshold, we then put out a competitive RFP process to build new transmission and evaluate all those projects against one another. My personal favorite is the policy scenario. That's a lot of what Ellie's going to focus on today. And this starts to get really beyond that 10-year horizon. Traditionally, these types of studies have been kind of locked into 10 years because what sort of assumptions you make about what resources, which generators are actually going to be there beyond 10 years has been kind of a question mark. In the last few years, we've obtained this new tool. It's called a capacity expansion tool. It's part of that same model that we use now. But what it is able to do is it's able to build resources for us. So as you saw earlier, Carrie was showing, we know relatively, we have a load forecast. So we know the load is going to be going up. We don't necessarily know what is going to be serving those, or really what's the most economic way to get to a zero carbon future for the New England region, meeting all these state and policy goals that they've been laid out. What the policy scenario informs us on is, what are the different avenues how can we get there? What are the trade-offs from going from, let's focus on offshore wind to let's focus on SMRs, small modular nuclear reactors, all these different types of technologies. Through a scenario-based analysis, comparing these different outcomes, we can really get a better understanding of what would be the best way or the most economic way to obtain these futures. It's quite insightful. So I find that work really fascinating because it's quite novel. So, and finally, there's the stakeholder requested scenario. This is for anything that doesn't fit within the frameworks of these other three scenarios. Previously, the economic studies had been really only stakeholder requested scenario. So when stakeholders had an idea for a study they wanted to do, they say, oh, can the ISO look at that? We'd say, okay, yes, and fill out all these other assumptions. by having these three base scenarios, it's a great framework to start off of. And we also offer sensitivities of each one of these scenarios. So you can do a small modification. I'll go over a little bit more what that is in a little bit, but anything that doesn't really fit within this framework, we have the opportunity to model that as well. So sensitivity versus scenario. So what you just saw before were the 4 scenarios that we have. What we call a sensitivity would be an incremental change to one of those scenarios. So let's say in the policy scenario, we wanted to, or the system efficiency needs scenario, we wanted to add 4,000 megawatts of dual fuel capability to existing natural gas-fired units. We would say that would probably be a sensitivity because it's an incremental change. It's a small change from kind of the work we're already doing. Whereas a complete scenario, what would we maybe put under the stakeholder requested scenario would be, analyzing the effects on reliabilities of compensating resources through PPAs versus PPAs and a reliability adder for the policy scenario. That kind of gets to the scope where it's, okay, we have this different framework that requires a lot more work and a completely different scenario to do that. So just wanted to kind of provide a little bit of perspective on the difference between these two types of requests. All right, so let's get into the actual modeling tool that we used. So first, we have the production cost model. And what that answers the question to is, how will the system operate hour by hour, and how much will it cost to operate that system? So again, 8760 is a number that you become quite familiar with when you get into this type of modeling. It's how many hours there are in a year. And what we're able to do is capture detailed system operations, including daily and seasonal variability. And so what you can see on the right-hand side here, the green graph on the top right is an output of our model. And what that is, it's the locational marginal price. It's like the hourly price of electricity. You think of a stock ticker, you see the price going up and down over time. Well, in our markets, we have hourly prices, or in the real-time market, we have 5-minute LMPs that are changing every 5 minutes. In our model, we're able to produce hourly LMPs. So you can see for this particular year, we had some price spikes in the January, February times. Through summer, it was pretty low, and then come back to winter, there was a couple more price spikes. We're able to produce detailed hourly statistics like this for a future system, as well as feeding an input into it, such as an ISO New England load. So on the bottom right, you can see what the hourly load profile looks like, and you can see the high load of winter. As we fall into the spring, the load goes down, back into summer, it goes up, fall down, and then into the next winter, we go back up. And so that's an input we can put into our model, but it's very detailed. It's fully hourly. So as I mentioned, it can model real-time dispatch of power plants based on hourly demand, fuel prices, outages, and operational characteristics. And the objective function of this model, we feed it all this detail about operational, and we really put a price tag on many of these attributes as well. And what we're trying to do is minimize our operational costs such that this fuel and maintenance and shutdown costs. So we're serving load at the lowest cost to the system. We can evaluate today's system or in the near future, but we typically model this production cost model in a 1-year horizon. And in terms of modeling the transmission network, we can do a really high level, no constraints within New England. Let's just understand what the energy problem is, down to let's model all of the transmission lines and get a very specific model, which is a nodal model, where we can understand where those economic inefficiencies may occur through congestion. So then the more fun model to me is the capacity expansion model. And so that kind of expands on the production cost model and says, what investment should the region make in the future to meet demand reliably and affordably? The graph on the left, on the top one, you're seeing this is actually an input into our model. So you're seeing what the historical CO2 emissions of the New England region has been. And then what we actually do is we feed a constraint that says, starting where we are now, we want to be, let's say, 1 million tons in 2050 is what we typically put into the model. And we'll just have a glide path down. So that's actually a constraint that goes through the model. And on the below that, you see the load. So you can kind of see that summer winter pattern from before, but instead of just 1 year, we're starting at 2033, going all the way to 2050. So you can see over time, we see that load growing. And that can be from things like electrification, EVs, electric heating as well. And so the way this model works is it actually is very similar to the model before, but it simplifies the problem. Because we're solving not just one whole year, but we're solving, potentially 20, 30 years at a time, we need to make that how much it costs to serve the grid problem a little bit simpler. And so what it does is it uses representative days instead. So it just takes a few days throughout the year and says, okay, this is what 2033 looks like. This is what 2034 looks like. And so it's a kind of piecemeal approach of simplifying the problem. And then what it does is it focuses on that long term, what should we build? What units can we build? So how much does it cost to operate the system? And is it actually cheaper if we put in a new generator to actually serve load rather than just flexing the existing fleet? What the overall function of this model is to reduce the total system costs. So that's how much it costs to operate the grid, as well as how much it costs to build new resources as well. So it's taking both of those in. And we usually do this at a regional network size. So we want to say just talking about the whole New England rather than looking at the individual nodal, because this is a larger question about what type of resources we should build. How does building one resource over another affect the New England system? And kind of what are the timeframes that we think would be most economic? And so I believe that's the end of my section, kind of high level view before we get into results. I promise that Ellie will make all of this make sense when she sees results, but I'd be glad to take any questions.
Right. It looks like we have one question, Richard, from David's iPad. What do you think of incentivizing dispersed energy generation? I assume that means distributed energy resources and or networks to reduce the inefficiency of more transmission lines.
So that's an approach. That's something where the scenario-based analysis that we do here can help answer a question like that, because we can say, what's the cost of building a new transmission line here versus what's the cost of actually putting the resources in. So, it's hard to give a general answer. I live in the modeling world, so my answer to this would be, let me throw it in my model and see what it says. But it's very scenario dependent. Sometimes building resources out across the network can really help build reliability. Sometimes the most affordable and most reliable thing is to put a new transmission line in. It's really a give or take situation.
Right.
Each boat had a.
Yeah, please mute
And,
if you're not
if I
speaking.
may add to that, I agree with that answer in that there are challenges to both of the approaches, transmission and local generation siting. There's different communities impacted by different types of projects. And from what I've seen, watching some of these conversations unfold in New England, is that neither one is necessarily the silver bullet, but that it's a combination of the two of all of the approaches that seems to be the most feasible. But that also the idea of using less or using what we have more efficiently was something that we just can't take for granted. And so that's the idea of demand response and peak shaving. Those things are very important. The answer is just not to always build more, but to do better with what we have.
Thanks for that, Carrie. See that Ed has asked a long question here. I'm wondering if this should be deferred. The answer could be deferred until after Ellie speaks about accelerated decarbonization. But it's about the impact of accelerating development and interconnection of DERs. Yeah, so Ed, let's come back to that at the end if Ellie doesn't address that in her slides.
Good idea.
And I'm not seeing any other questions now, so
I see a hand.
I'm sorry. Yes, from Arnie. Go ahead, Arnie.
Yeah, thanks, Roy. I have a question on, I think it was the previous slide, that had two graphs. The top right one is showing cost per megawatt hour, and those peaks are occurring during the winter heating season. And the bottom right one is showing what I understand to be peak demand. So my question is this a model result, or is this historical data? If it's a model result, why would the cost per megawatt hour have the peaks only in the heating season and not during the summer peak, which from the bottom right looks like it's certainly is higher than the winter peak?
Yes, so good question. The answer to this is, first of all, the top right graph is indeed an output of the model. Is this particular scenario is looking at a 2040 case. What you're seeing below on the bottom right is the load with that 2040 case in 2040. And in this particular scenario, what's driving it is there's some congestion on the system, as well as some demand from winter heating that's happening at different times of day. So, that's one of the difficulties of new load is new load has new characteristics, and those new characteristics can sometimes stress the system in ways we haven't seen before. I think this particular graph has really high LMP spikes that we don't normally see in our cases. I just wanted to illustrate it. If I was to run this case, I would probably throw a few more resources into it, because I'd say, seeing $500 a megawatt hour in our model is indicative of, there's probably not something right. So does that help answer your question a little bit?
Yeah, it does. But I was also wondering whether the model incorporates a projection of natural gas demand and the projected price of natural gas. I mean, what we often hear is that the reason we get spikes in the real-time cost of electricity in the winter is because of the competition for natural gas between building heating and electricity generation. So I was wondering if part of that spike in cost was a projection that said in 2040, if that's the date for this, that we anticipate, natural gas during these periods of time is going to cost much more during these periods where you have high demand for heating as well.
Yes. So for the model to work, we do have to have a price to gas. Usually what we do is, for the New England-wide region, we have a price that changes year over year. In this particular model, we're not doing a detailed gas analysis, but we do have that capability. And in models that we do have that, it does exactly what you had mentioned, which is we can put in, essentially, it's called LDC demand. That's what the heating demand is on the natural gas system. So what every person's furnace to heat their house, how much that's taking off the grid. So we can know, okay, that's how much gas is being used to heat people's house. The way the gas markets work is usually everything that's left after that winter heating is available to the electric generation. And so in our model, what we've done is we do, not in this one, but in other models that we have a constraint that says, okay, you have between your whole pipeline, the total capacity available. Let's remove the amount that has already been taken to account for heating of people's housing. And then what we can say is, okay, now this leftover gas is what's available to the electric generation. Once we run out of all of that pipeline gas, we switch over to something more expensive. First, we switch over to liquid natural gas. In New England, we have 2 LNG terminals. There's also a nearby one in Canada as well. But that comes at a premium. So we have a higher cost for once we start running on LNG. And then once we run out of those LNG terminals, we say, okay, let's switch over to oil. And so that's to kind of simulate, those really cold or those really hot days, the days in which we have the highest demand and we start to run lean on our available fuels. We do have the ability to model what those price impacts would be for switching from gas to natural gas to LNG and then to oil. And we can demonstrate that as well. But again, that's not in this particular model, but it is something that we do have the capability of modeling. And you are right. It is something that the region faces with constraints on natural gas systems.
Okay, so just to wrap up and make sure I understand that the model results shown here do not project the increase in the price of gas due to the demand for home heating during the heating season. It's more congestion on the transmission lines that is driving those peaks in the heating season. Is that what?
Yeah, and I think, and again, this is more just illustrative to be like, this is what a model output would be. I really defer to the next few slides where Ellie goes over specific model results because I just wanted to show, this is what an hourly output may look like for the grid.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Richard, another factor may be that the supply of PV in the winter is a lot less than in the summer. So while the demand looks, there's a peak in the winter because we'll have a winter peaking system by 2040, we're not going to have much solar in the winter. So the combination of those two things probably explains those peaks.
Yeah, as well as the ramping effects that may occur around the sun setting as well too.
Okay. All right, I'm not seeing any more questions or hands raised, so let's move on to the next slide. And that will be Ellie.
Yeah, we can go right into the next slide. So as Richard explained, we have the 4 reference scenarios for the economic studies. We'll be focusing mainly on the policy scenario results today, and then in the study report too, that's mostly going over policy scenario results. So here we have the build out. This is what the model suggests we'll need to build between 2033 and 2050 to meet that growing electricity demand that we have forecasted while also reducing emissions. Sorry, I'm getting a little echo.
So please mute if you're not the speaker.
Okay. But yeah, so we have that carbon constraint implemented that Richard had shown that's linearly declining to represent when the system meets the decarbonization goal. So these graphs are showing individual build-outs for resource type, and you can also see the planned capacity for 2033 and then the average capacity needed per year. In total, the model says we'll need about 81 gigawatts of new capacity. Now we're modeling all of this on top of the existing fleet in New England. So by 2050, the system is about 130 gigawatts in size. What's interesting here, looking at the bigger picture, is we can see the model is telling us the most economic solution for meeting these decarbonization goals is diversity in the resource mix. So we have a combination of PV, land-based and offshore wind, batteries, and small modular reactors. Just to highlight a few of the resource types on this slide, and then we'll go into more detail on some of the more interesting ones. For solar, we're assuming this is all large-scale utility PV, but some of this build-out could also be met by rooftop solar behind the meter. And then this is the largest build out just because PV is the cheapest resource type. Looking at land-based wind, you'll see it ramps up right at the beginning and then levels off. We do have a limit in the model on how much land-based wind can be built. This is just to represent the limit of available ridge lines remaining in New England for land-based wind. We see that this resource type is inexpensive and can produce a lot of energy. So the model wants to build all of it early on. And then the last one I'll highlight on this slide is just short duration batteries. So short duration means 4-hour or 8-hour lithium ion batteries. The model will start adding them around 2040 once there are a lot of renewables on the grid to charge the batteries from. And then operationally, we see them cycling about once a day. They'll charge midday when it's sunny out, and then discharge either during the evening peak or if there's a winter morning heating peak. But we can go into the next slide. We'll zoom in on offshore wind first. So this is one of the more expensive resources to build, but it plays a big role in a clean, affordable electricity future. Right now in New England, we have a few offshore wind projects in the works. We have Block Island running, and then Vineyard and Revolution are both coming soon. But we will need a lot more to achieve the state goals by 2050. So the model can pick from two types, either the fixed bottom turbines, that's like what's off Block Island. So those are built in shallower waters south of the Cape. And then it also can build floating or wind turbines. In the Gulf of Maine, the water is too deep to anchor the turbines to the sea floor, so they are floating instead. The model ends up building 11.8 gigawatts of floating offshore wind and 5.1 gigawatts of fixed offshore wind. So even though it costs more than land-based wind or solar, offshore wind produces more energy consistently, especially in the winter. We also ran a sensitivity that didn't allow new offshore wind, and the total cost of the system went up by about 16%, just because we had to build more expensive resource types. So even with the higher upfront costs, offshore wind helps keep the build out more affordable. And then on the right-hand side, you'll see that if the technology matures slowly or the construction costs stay high, the model pushes most of the offshore wind construction to after 2040. But in both cases, the takeaway is the same, which is that the cost of decarbonization will go up if we don't have offshore wind in our future resource mix. We can go on to slide 20, or not slide 20, whatever, next slide. So now we'll talk about a newer kind of nuclear technology, which is small modular reactors, or SMRs. These are about 1/3 the size of our traditional nuclear reactors. So there are none operational right now in North America, but there's one under construction in Ontario that should be online by 2030. And then the US DOE is sponsoring 2 projects in the US right now that are supposed to be operational within 10 years. So our previous economic study, the EPSET study, I think Roy mentioned at the beginning, didn't include SMRs in the reference case. And as you can see in the graph on the top left, that case had to lean heavily on offshore wind and batteries to keep the grid running cleanly, especially in the winter. This time with SMRs in the resource mix, the model built 5.1 gigawatts. That's mostly after 2045. And that helps to avoid overbuilding those other expensive resources. So even though SMRs are expensive to build, they're very useful in decarbonizing those target winter hours where demand is high, but we don't have a lot of production from solar and wind. If you look at the bottom left chart, you'll see they are mainly operating during the winter months, which makes them an effective seasonal backup. That's kind of replacing the role of traditional fossil fuel generation. On to the next slide. All right, the last one we'll focus on is 100-hour batteries, what we would call long duration energy storage, or LDES. These differ from the 4-hour and 8-hour lithium ion batteries, since these are designed to store energy for days at a time instead of just a few hours. The long duration energy storage we're modeling are iron air batteries, which store energy by rusting and unrusting energy, or rusting and unrusting iron. And you can see that on that little diagram in the center there. The first of these is under construction in Minnesota and is expected to be operational by the end of the year. And there's also one planned for northern Maine that should be operational in 2028. Our modeling found that long duration energy storage struggled to be economically competitive with SMRs. One reason is that long duration energy storage needs excess renewable energy to charge. But with SMRs in the mix, we don't build as much extra solar and wind, so there's less energy to charge these big batteries. And then batteries also have limits on how often they can be used just because they need time and energy available to charge. So as that graph on the bottom left shows, those 100-hour batteries sit mostly unused during the winter, staying below about 10% state of charge on average. SMRs, as we saw on the previous slide, can be dispatched as often as they're needed during the winter. So still the model does build a small amount of long duration energy storage from 2045 to 2050, which shows that they can provide some economic benefits in the long term. And then on to the next. All right, so far we've focused on the reference case, which is the main pathway to decarbonization by 2050. But we also explored what the build out would look like if we wanted to reach those decarbonization goals even sooner. So to test that, we tightened the annual carbon constraint in the model, forcing it to reach 100% decarbonization in 2040 instead of 2050. The end result for the build out looks pretty similar in terms of the total capacity built, but the pace of construction really speeds up in the earlier years from 2033 to 2040. And that results in a cost increase of about 36% because we'd be investing in newer, less mature technologies sooner before supply chains are fully built out. So for these newer technologies like offshore wind and SMRs, we take our cost assumptions from NREL, the National Renewable Energy Laboratories, and they model a decreasing price over time as these technologies and their supply chains are developed. On the other hand, versus this sensitivity, if we wanted to delay the decarbonization timeline beyond 2050, it would reduce costs, but we'd also delay the climate benefits. So this was just one of the sensitivities we ran for this study, but I'll hand it back over to Richard. He'll share where you can find more sensitivity results and more details on next steps.
Sure. Thanks, Ellie. So economic studies is a process that we are continuing to conduct. We meet usually monthly, depends on when we're presenting or not, at the Planning Advisory Committee. This is a committee that the ISO hosts. It's open to the public. You can find the link to that here. If you're interested in finding more of our presentations as well, you can see the economic studies page on the ISO New England website here as well. But that's where we usually discuss these topics and have back and forth with stakeholders, because it's a back and forth process. We want to get stakeholder feedback on our scenarios, whether we're grounded in reality or not, or often find very rich diversity of opinion through these stakeholder forums as well. The economic study report itself we're nearing the end of the 24 economic study. So we're planning in Q3 of this year to be studying our final report. And this report will focus primarily on the policy and the stakeholder requested scenarios. Additionally, if you're interested, the ISO will be hosting a public webinar at the conclusion of the economic study. I can provide follow-up information once that's been scheduled. It hasn't quite been scheduled at this point. So that's the economic studies, and I'm sure you have plenty of questions for Ellie.
Indeed, there are a few questions already. So let me go back to a couple that we passed over. But first, thank you for this presentation. Very, very informative and stimulating. So questions from Michael regarding offshore wind. I'll try to rephrase these slightly. There's a question about kind of the delaying by the present administration, delaying of offshore wind. And what is your thinking about dealing with that? If we're sticking directly to the modeling process, maybe we can just talk about how flexible the modeling process is. And I see that slide is directly applicable. And then Michael's other question on this was, how you describe the stake that non-coastal regions, like in the center of New England rather than along the coast, what's their stake in offshore wind? And I think that's the purpose of the grid, but I'm sure you can discuss that in more detail. Go ahead.
Sure. For the first question, I would just point to these sensitivities that we ran, looking at a few different pathways for offshore wind.
Are you going to be able to make the meeting on Thursday in Hull?
Yeah, Stephen, if you could mute, please. Thanks.
In the links that are on the next step slide, you'll be able to find more detailed results for those sensitivities from our PAC presentations. But the overall takeaway that we found is that offshore wind is key to decarbonization. I mean, you can see here in our build out timeline, even with the delay, we are still building offshore over the entire time horizon. And then the second question about benefits for people in non-coastal regions. So we are a regional electricity operator. There will be some differences in LMPs based on congestion, as Richard mentioned. But generally, that electricity is not necessarily going to go to coastal regions. So this will provide benefits region-wide in terms of prices.
Great. Thanks, Ellie. Next question I see is from Ed Wool about how the acceleration of distributed energy resources would affect, reduce the need for high voltage transmission lines and could help avoid using fossil fuel generation. So, yeah, maybe you could speak about the how these slides all talk about the renewable resources and SMRs. So perhaps you could also talk about the implication for fossil outside the renewables and emissions-free resources.
Sure, yeah. So talking about distributed energy resources, all of these will help contribute to the increased capacity that we'll need, especially talking about clean distributed energy resources like solar or batteries. And then Carrie kind of spoke to the question about transmission line expansion. Again, it's kind of a trade-off. The most benefits will come from having a diversity in our solutions. And then let's see, the second part of the question, avoid using fossil fuel electricity generation plants. So the actual dispatch will be set by prices, but generally we see these renewables are cheaper to run because they don't have fuels associated versus fossil fuel generation plants.
And I just want to add to that answer, Ellie, that the cases that we're showing here do have a carbon constraint. So what we are looking at here is the phasing out of fossil energy as we start to replace that, and you start to see the needs of the system, how they change as we start to decrease our fossil fleet over time. So they do help, and that's what you're seeing here is a build out of resources to help minimize carbon production in the electric sector.
Right. Okay, and then Ellie, there are a couple of questions on new resources, on new batteries using salt or I guess sodium, and are there SMRs under construction or operating in Europe yet? So maybe more generally, you could speak to the question of how you decide which kind of resources you want to study. You mentioned SMRs, which may be a few years away from the first of kind installation. So what's your criterion for which kind of resources you study and which ones you defer until a later study?
Sure. So this is actually a new criteria that we developed at the beginning of the 2024 economic study for which candidate resource types we're modeling. So as I said, we didn't include SMRs or long duration energy storage in the base case last time. So the criteria is it needs to be clean, carbon-free. It needs to have either a state contract. So that's where we're getting the floating offshore wind. There were some leases auctioned off last fall, or it needs to be under construction or planned for development in the United States. So that pulls in SMRs and the long duration energy storage. I will say there are more types of long duration energy storage, different thermal using salt, where we're modeling the iron air. This is one of the more commercially available types. So that's why we have chosen the iron air.
I know iron air has some characteristics in common with some of the thermal batteries in terms of the round trip efficiency and how much duration is feasible. So there's one question at the end here from Mayim. I think this refers to slide 20, just to get the dates right. On the second bullet, talking about the 2024 study being published last year, and I think it's going to be published towards the end of this year.
That is correct. You caught my typo. It is Q3 of 2025 that it will be published. So that is coming later this year.
Okay. Let's see. I see one hand from Ed. Why don't you go ahead, Ed?
Yeah, you've got a carbon CO2 emission model. And what do you assume in terms of the electricity rate base by state? That's a state. Each rate is set by the states. Many states have add-ons. There's a difference between muni rates and investor-owned utility rates. Have you run a model based upon lowering the electricity rate people pay as an incentive to go ahead and accelerating their own decision to go ahead and use heat pumps and other non-fossil fuel sources? What would that look like?
So I can take that one. We here are focusing primarily on this study at the wholesale electricity prices. And so that is a component of what is paid on your electric bill, but is by no means, like you said, the states are the ones who are setting the rates through many different organizations. And I'm sure Carrie would be able to answer that a little bit more detailed, but we're looking here primarily at wholesale electricity rates. We have in the past done some analysis of what is the effects of procuring resources through either the capacity auction versus through PPAs. And that's about the extent of which we've done, which gets closer to ratepayer analysis, but we have not touched that because we do not have any purview on how rates are formed. And Carrie, I don't know, are you still on the call here?
I don't see her. And
Can you hear me?
she needed to leave. Oh,
yes,
sorry.
I can hear
Can
you.
you hear me? Oh, sorry, I'm here. Yes, that's exactly right. There are so many components that are part of those retail rates. There's storm response. There's things like tree trimming and pole replacement. There's low income like heating and cooling programs that are all part of the retail rate, and then we differ across the 6 New England states. That's just something that we just don't have any granularity or authority over. So it's very hard for us to not only model those types of impacts, but for us to take a stance and say, this is what that would be in the future. There's just so many unknowns.
All right. Richard, does that address your answer there? We can pick up the next question, then I think I'll ask one, and then I see that we have Arnie and Paul in the queue. So here in Massachusetts, we're blessed with multiple startups working on different long duration batteries, iron air and thermal and whatnot. And I think the legislature heard that, and their climate bill last year called for procurement of 5 gigawatts of battery storage, including 750 megawatts of multi-day storage. So 5 gigawatts of BESS by the year 2030. And this is way more than the 2024 economic study shows needed by 2030. So I wonder 2 things. Did the legislators ask you for input as they were putting together the bill? And secondly, when you model policy goals, do you include things like this requirement for procurement or just the emissions?
I'll let the team talk about the modeling inputs, but ISO, we wouldn't ever provide we provide technical expertise to the state legislators when they're creating any sort of new laws, but they really rely on their state energy offices for guidance on what types of energy goals are feasible. What we would offer perspective and expertise on is what that would mean, any type of goal would mean for the bulk power system and how that would interact with the existing system. That being said, energy storage can participate in our markets. It already does participate in our markets, and it can also act as a transmission asset. So energy storage is existing in New England now. It's just what we, it will depend on the deployment and how long the storage options are. But, that's something that we wait and see, that we'll have to wait and see, and the team can talk about modeling. But from a technical standpoint, ISO, we don't ever say lobby for a specific type of technology or bill in a state.
Right.
Sure, and to speak to the modeling question, so we're not modeling those procurement targets. That could be where our modeling diverges from the modeling that they used to develop that energy storage target. So looking at 2030, I think you said it was, we're modeling only resources that are in service or have a capacity supply obligation or state contract, whereas their models might include more procurement targets if they have additional, solar or wind targets for 2030 that may allow the energy storage to perform better.
Great.
Yeah, and just to add to that too, the states all have different RPS, renewable portfolio standards, classification for resources, and it gets very difficult for us when we have 6 states that classify renewables in all different types of categories, and their different goals are, they have different goals. How that cost gets allocated across the entire system. We don't typically deal with cost allocation. Again, that gets more into the ratepayer side of things. And so it gets complicated for us to say, Connecticut have this many of this type of solar. And it gets so granular that it's almost makes the modeling impossible. So usually we do this higher level. Let's look at the CO2. Let's look at the resources that we know will be available commercially, or the different types of resources, and kind of feed that for a little bit more of like a higher level perspective.
Great. Thanks. Arnie, I see your hand there, but Paul's also raised one for his first question. So,
thank you, Roy. So with the decarbonization of transportation, you're modeling moving to EVs. The other alternative is in theory, mode shifting into more trains and buses. And I imagine the latter would have much less impact on the grid and the future needs. And I was wondering if there are enough financial incentive there that beyond just the relative costs of mode shifting versus EVs, whether somehow markets should take into account the grid savings of mode shifting versus going to EVs.
I would say from a public policy perspective, we don't have any policies that we can point to model with concrete dates. Where the electrification, we have, Massachusetts has a goal of this by then, and Rhode Island has a goal of this by then. There is no type of policy to incentivize that type of transportation shift. So
if the numbers were, if the financial savings were enough, that could create a need for policy, right? I guess I'm trying to get a sense of would there be substantial savings if there were policies that were pushing for mode shifting versus EVs?
So what I would say to that is that we're not experts on the transportation sector, but I do think that this would be something that would be interesting to model. Where I struggle with that to actually come up with the numbers behind this, that I do think someone like a state utility agency or the state as a whole might have information on, would be, what are the cost assumptions behind those? How much does it actually cost to operate operate something like that versus operating EVs? I don't know the cost associated with that, and I also don't know what the electrical demand is going to be on the system, because we focus on the electric sector. So.
Right.
And I would say that these are questions when we make these assumptions and we pick what resources, it's almost endless what types of things you could think about, right? And it's at one point from a modeling perspective, we do have to make some choices about what it is specifically that we're going to include. And, you know, that's the limitation of modeling. We aren't making any statements about these are the answers. These are some scenarios based on certain policies that we have explored. And the idea behind all of this is that we are starting the conversation with all regional stakeholders to say, these are some options that we need to think about as a community of stakeholders. And here we can start having a conversation about what does state policy do, what do changes in federal policy do, and how are we going to think about solutions. So these aren't prescriptive in any way or necessarily answering those questions. But, you know, the idea is that we have this base of knowledge and this data that we have in our economic studies process in our team. How can we continue this conversation onwards and make progress towards types of solutions?
Right, thank you for that. And Arnie, I think you might have a last question.
Well, actually, I have three separate but somewhat related questions. I guess the first one, the question was already asked about the impact of distributed energy resources, and from the slide that you've got up now, particularly for PV, that's utility PV. But I guess my question is, when you did your projection, did you also have a projection of what the increase in distributed energy resources would be, and how, and did that, I presume, if you did, that would impact the capacity of the other resources that you're showing on this slide?
Sure. So
I can. Oh. Go ahead, Ellie.
Yeah, I was just going to say, in terms of the starting resource mix in 2033, we get that from the CELT, which has a forecast for behind the meter PV. But beyond that, we're not forecasting any specific growth of those resources. So we don't have a distinction in the model between utility and behind the meter PV, but operationally, they are going to be, you know, having similar production profiles, and can kind of be equivalent in terms of providing this capacity.
So should I be thinking of that upper left-hand graph as actually a combination of utility scale and distributed energy solar? Is that?
Yeah, behind the meter PV.
Okay.
Yeah.
I would say the one caveat to that would be that one of the statistics that we're not showing here is curtailed energy. We do not have the ability as the ISO to curtail a resource. And what curtailment means is that, you know, if a PV unit is generating more than the grid is able to take, then unless there's some way to utilize that energy, it could be a behind the meter battery that you have as well. That energy may go to waste, and that waste is called curtailment. And so something that becomes very important as we get these larger injections of PV is that we be able to control it, because, you know, here we're seeing 45 gigawatts of PV on our system. If we're not able to control that, which we can do with utility PV, and at least at this time cannot do with behind the meter rooftop PV, that is a very large consideration. So I would say that a portion of this could be behind the meter PV, but by no means all of it could be behind the meter PV.
The next question I had to do with, well, I'm sure each state, but in particular Massachusetts, you know, has done its own modeling, and that's reflected in something called the Clean Energy and Climate Plan, and they've published the results of their models for the capacity of different resources, not only for Massachusetts, but actually all of New England. And their results are significantly different than the ones that you're showing here. I'm just sort of wondering, do you collaborate at all with the folks who do like the modeling for the Clean Energy and Climate Plan in Massachusetts or any other state, or do you do this entirely on your own? Because, you know, we are, you know, and I know there's a lot of uncertainty here, but there is significant differences between the, you know, the results of the Massachusetts modeling for future capacity of different resources and what you're showing here. So is there any, do you look at or collaborate with the folks who did this sort of, you know, the modeling for the different states?
So for this
Richard,
effort,
is it okay?
go on, Carrie. Yeah,
Oh, no.
please go ahead.
No, I'll follow up after you.
Okay, I was gonna say for this particular effort, we do not work directly with the states, and what I'll say is that these future-looking models in particular are incredibly sensitive to inputs, and I think what you might be catching here too is that there's many different inputs. Price signals are usually the ones that are going to be the most impactful. So I haven't looked at the particular Massachusetts study that you're referencing here, but what they might find is that building more 100-hour batteries makes more sense, but they might have a lower cost assumption than we do. Generally, we share a lot of data inputs across the industry for these types of studies through the national labs or EIA as well, the Energy Information Agency. But for this particular effort, no, we did not collaborate with the states directly. And Carrie?
Yeah, and I would say that, that plan, I believe, was finalized in 2022 and began being developed in 2020 or 2019 when it kicked off. So there is a lag in time, and there have been some significant changes in economic drivers since then. But while we don't necessarily use their models or their inputs, all of this is done through the PAC meetings that the ISO holds, and we present our assumptions, we present our modeling inputs, and our whole process is public and discussed with stakeholders, and that is open to any of our New England states. And we often have participants from the state. So in Massachusetts, it would be EEA who are coming to those meetings. And then this is made public. So not that we didn't reach out to that exact author, but those states are aware of these activities. We're updating them on them and the entire process. So if they had really different assumptions, or they thought we were going something they felt really differently about, they would have an opportunity to submit a comment or feedback publicly on those assumptions. And that, again, that's just part of the when we are looking, especially so far out into 2050, that small assumptions that we are making as the ISO in 2024 can have large repercussions in the future.
Thanks. Yeah, and my final question is related to the one that you got about, transportation and mode shifting. How did you end up coming up with what your projected demand would be in, over the next 25 years? I mean, there must have been some assumption about, number of electric vehicles, number of homes who retrofit to heat pumps. And I don't, can you comment on that?
Sure.
Yeah,
so for
go on, Ellie.
We actually newly are publishing a long-term load forecast, but this study was started before that had been fully developed. So the load that we're using was developed by our load forecasting team, starting with the EPSET study. So we're just carrying on with the assumptions from that. In this case, we're looking at decarbonization of the heating and transportation sectors as much as possible. So there are going to be, some buildings or some fleets that can't be electrified, but generally what we're modeling here for the load is as close to 100% decarbonization of those sectors as possible.
And I know that we're close to your time. I want to say that, Arnie and Roy, if you have follow-up questions, Roy has my email. I'm happy to answer any follow-up questions and share our materials, and that then once we do have a date for the public webinar that we will have in the fall at these studies, that will be all posted to our PAC website and the ISO website, and we can make sure you have that information as well for those that would like to dive further in.
That's terrific. Thank you. Yeah, look forward to that. And thanks so much for taking time out of your busy days and addressing us with this very interesting information. It's really going to affect all of us and all the customers in New England. So thanks for that, and we'll be in touch. Mayan, did you want to say any closing words?
Well, thanks all for coming and sticking out this whole session. Quite a lot of us did and learned a lot. So thank you so much for a great session. And I just sent Arnie a note. Maybe we can put a note that you'll have that public webinar coming up in the fall when we post your slides and video. Is that okay? Okay, I see.
And Roy, we can get you Roy, if you don't mind, we'll send you a presentation with that typo corrected. So you can post the correct one for the group. We'll get that to you tomorrow.
Thank you so much, Carrie.
All right, thanks so much.
All right, I think that wraps it up. So
Thank you.
Thank you, Ellie. Thank you, Richard. Thank you all.
Thank you all. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
Thanks, Roy, for a great job there that you did too. Thank you.
Oh.